Sorry, I've lost my chain now. Because
No.
Yeah, sorry, you keep interrupting. It's quite hard to keep the train of thought when you keep heckling from the sideline.
Of questioners.
Yeah.
Peter. Sorry.
Steve. That's not a term you should use in a select committee.
Now, Steve.
You shouldn't
Peter.
I would argue that it's a very well-established term to describe leaving without a deal.
Just to draw this little exchange to a close.
On apologies to the witness. Members are entitled to put the questions they want in the terms in which they want, and if we were all to interject because we object to the terms in which the question is put, our sessions will be even longer than they are already. I suggest we allow each member to ask their question, respect their ability to do so. The floor is with Stephen Kinnock now.
Thank you, Chair. That the implications for our economy and for our national security and for the Good Friday Agreement would be very concerning indeed. Would you agree that we are now much closer to that scenario than we have ever been?
No. I think that for some time there's been a majority in Parliament that's against no deal. I think it's spoken on a number of occasions, and it drove the initiative in March and April to not only seize the order paper but also to pass primary legislation requiring the Prime Minister to extend Article 50, which was a very effective way of preventing no deal. In the end, by the time the legislation was passed, the Prime Minister already decided to extend Article 50, so it didn't have the effect that it might otherwise have had, but otherwise it would have been a very effective instrument in stopping the Prime Minister from doing so. My sense is that that majority is still there, and I think that, and I hope, that in 2 weeks some of those currently in the Cabinet may feel, if they're not in the Cabinet, I think they won't be, that they would join with those that want to take action to prevent no deal. So I think the numbers may change in the next couple of weeks.
But on the other hand, the future of the country, or the government at least, is now in the hands of 160,000 Conservative Party members, the majority of whom appear to embrace the idea of leaving without a deal, and the Prime Minister, the candidate who looks highly likely to win, has said we will leave on the 31st of October come hell or high water, and the legal default position under European law, under the terms of Article 50, of course, is that there's no alternative on the table, we leave without a deal. Do you not feel that that's stacking up towards massively increasing the likelihood of leaving without a deal on the 31st of October?
It certainly increased the risk. The legal default's been the same since Article 50 was triggered, so that hasn't changed. It was the legal default on March the 29th, it's the legal default on October the 31st, so that's neutral as to who the Prime Minister is. The current Prime Minister for many months said it's my deal or no deal. If you don't vote through my deal, we're going to crash out without a deal. That was the way she put it. I accept that an incoming Prime Minister might ramp that up, but that's where the political fight is with Parliament as to where the numbers are on preventing no deal. But the risks have gone up.
The risk has gone up, yes. Just looking at the sort of sequencing of events between the collapse of the cross-party talks and the publication of the withdrawal agreement bill, were you surprised? Was there anything in the withdrawal agreement bill that hadn't been discussed in the cross-party talks?
I don't think the bill was ever published.
Well,
I think what the Prime Minister did was to indicate some of the features that might be in the bill.
Yes, so there was a list of 10 points. Which, there
was, but I think I'm right in saying it was never published. One of the issues that we had to grapple with in the talks was that we would sometimes try to explore a position, let's say on customs, in ordinary language, and then ask the government to look at what that would actually look like in a bill. And suddenly what you thought you'd been exploring didn't quite match up with what's in the bill. That's not critical of anyone, it's just that there's often a gap between what people say they're trying to achieve and what is actually written in a bill. So I don't think the bill was there. But I think some of the things that have been discussed were certainly identified by the Prime Minister when she unveiled what she said was going to be in the bill. What happened next vindicated one of my central concerns, because I think it was March the 14th, so a couple of weeks before we started the cross-party talks, the Prime Minister had had a vote on the extension of Article 50, and on her own side, only 112 of her MPs had followed her whip, and 188 had broken the whip. And throughout the talks, one of my central concerns, and I kept challenging the other side, it was a friendly challenge, it wasn't an aggressive in any way, was have you got the you're putting these proposals on the table, have you got the numbers on your side to carry this off? And I was really worried that they never really had the numbers. And of course, the Prime Minister announced some of the features of the implementing legislation at the beginning of the week, and I think by the Friday she had been forced to say she was leaving as Prime Minister. And if ever there was evidence that our judgment call was right, that she couldn't in fact deliver, and this is not critical of her, they're just the numbers, that was it, because she showcased some of what we've been discussing and not all of it, and her own party decided that was enough for them to require her to leave as Prime Minister. And I have no doubt that the same would have happened if we'd been standing alongside her. I just didn't. That deliverability was a massive problem, and I always had in my mind that the fact that 188 of her own side defied a three-line whip on simple extension, not particularly controversial, and a lot less controversial than some of the positions in the implementing legislation, and I couldn't see how the numbers were ever going to stack up.
If you, just sort of a hypothetical question, if, for example, the second referendum option and the revoke option were simply not on the table, and you had to choose between what was announced, you're right, not published, but what was announced, if you like, presented by the government as what would be the key features of a withdrawal agreement bill, and you had to choose between that WAB and crashing out without a deal, presumably you would choose the WAB over leaving the EU without a deal.
Well, obviously that's not the circumstance.
No.
There are other options, and therefore that's never been a choice we've been presented with. But yes, of course, leaving without a deal is better than leaving with a deal is better than leaving without a deal. But one has to be careful how far you take that, because the current Prime Minister's approach was obviously not to bring Parliament into the process during any point of the negotiations. And that, even the call to us to have cross-party talks was after the 29th of March. It wasn't the 11th hour, it was after midnight. And therefore, there was no consensus about what a deal might look like, no attempt to build that majority. And if the simple proposition is leaving with any deal is better than leaving with no deal, then that would require all of us to sign up to any deal, even if it's a Canada minus deal, because it got the word deal written at the top of it. In other words, it takes the whole critical role of MPs out of it altogether, because you simply say, well, as long as you've got something that's got deal written at the top and it's signed by the 27 and us, we'll have to vote for it in the end. It seemed to me that removed any effective scrutiny or challenge in Parliament.
Some have characterised the decision not to back the withdrawal agreement bill as allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Would you agree with that characterisation?
I think the political reality is that the implementing bill fell because within days of announcing it, the Prime Minister was taken out.
Do you think the timing was problematic? Because, of course, it was done just a few days before the European Parliament elections. Perhaps all parties were at their most partisan at that time.
Possibly, but I don't. The idea that the Prime Minister would bring just a few votes to the table and the Labour Party would provide the bulk of the votes, and this would be a happy arrangement that would leave her in post, I didn't think was realistic. In other words, the first test of the implementation legislation was, have you got your own side on board? If so, what then can the Labour Party add? And the Prime Minister didn't have her own side on board, because she announced some of what we'd been discussing, and the reaction of her own party was to say, we no longer want you as our Prime Minister. And therefore she hadn't got over the first hurdle of ensuring that she got enough on her own banks to begin a meaningful discussion with us about the passage of the bill. So, we said we wouldn't support it, but frankly, whatever we'd said, her own side had already formed a judgment on that pretty swiftly, and within a week she was had resigned as Prime Minister.
One final question. I asked Mr. Liddington earlier if he'd be comfortable with sharing the documents with the committee in terms of documents provided by the government to the Labour side, and I just wondered if we could ask the same question, if there are documents that were provided to the government in response to their proposals by...
Well, I heard what David said, and I think the sensible thing is for David and I to talk about it, and I obviously need to check on my side as to what our approach would be. He obviously wants to check with the other ministers and refresh and remind ourselves what the documents are, and that seems a sensible course of action.
Many thanks. Thank you, Chair.